Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video it is something very special because I'll be talking about another compact camera. It's this camera right here. It's the Canon Powershot G10. Now this camera has been out for quite a while now, actually since 2008, and to be honest this camera is still going very strong nowadays, and even though it doesn't produce the greatest and the best image quality out there, but it is another very powerful experimental camera that you can actually experiment with, and especially for the price under 80 euros or even under 70 euros in most places, it's really a camera that you can actually rely on and still experiment a lot of things with, and yet still being able to come home with good files that you can actually manipulate and edit with, simply because it does shoot raw. So in this video I'll actually share with you my thoughts on this camera, the pros and the cons. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon Powershot G10, now this is such a tiny camera. Well, to me it is a very tiny camera. It's so small, it's very nice and light in your hands, it's really nice and solidly built, and I feel like it's also a very good kind of mid-level compact if you're considering, between the G1 all the way to like, let's say the G16. It's kind of the middle ground. It's not like 100 euros of the G16, but it's also not like, let's say under 50 euros, but also like a 3.3 megapixel you get with the G1. But obviously if you're looking at something like the G1, you're probably going for a more nostalgic look and vibe, as well as, exploring that really old digital vibe, which of course this camera still gives a really nice and old vintage digital vibe, just not as vintage as the G1. Just keep that in mind, but it is a very nice and giving that bit of vintage vibe, digital vibe still, so that's actually quite nice as well. So in this video, just like as many of my, or actually all of my other My Thought videos on different cameras on my channel, I'll be dividing it into 3 different sections. So the first one, it'll be about the ergonomics and the usability, and then I'll lead down into the image quality for both videos and photography, well, photography first and then video, and then lead down into the conclusion of this camera, why I still like it, why I still recommend it, or should we actually go, a little bit higher, invest a little bit higher, maybe go for the G1X even, because it's really only about 100-ish euros, like 125 euros. Sometimes you can actually find a little bit of scratched up version for under 70 euros as well. So yeah, that's quite nice. So yeah, let's first dive into the usability and the ergonomic side of this camera. So the ergonomics and the usability, it actually feels very nice in hand, even though there's a little bit of hole here on the grip, but it's a very nice and solidly built camera. To be honest, it feels even more solid than the G16, even though it's much older and it's a much older tech than the G16, but the design of this camera feels more rugged, more tough. What I don't like about this camera though is that it doesn't have a fully articulated screen, but talking about the screen, it is still a very nice and usable screen. If you're taking a lot of fine detail pictures, you will still be able to see those details within the screen resolution, and it's actually quite nice. The only downside about the screen is that you might not be able to actually see it completely in direct sunlight. Although if it's like, let's say, a gloomy day and if you're outdoor, you actually still would be able to use the screen quite nicely and would still be able to actually judge your images quite nicely and judge your exposure, judge your color, judge everything pretty much about the composition and the image quite nicely as well. So that's actually quite good. But yeah, as I said, if you're working in bright light condition, then you might have to kind of shield the screen a little bit. And if you're just framing up for the images, in worst case scenarios, you might have to look through the viewfinder right here, which is not a viewfinder that what the lens sees. It's just a little viewfinder that this little rangefinder thing sees, and if you zoom, it actually zooms with you, so you're getting roughly, approximately almost what you're getting in terms of your composition, but just keep in mind it's not what the lens sees. And talking about the lens, moving on to the front, you can actually release this ring right here by pressing on that button, and then this ring comes out and you can add many more other accessories to this camera, and accessories like telephoto lenses, wide angle lenses, some special lens cover, things like that, and what have you. There's so many third-party options as well, so yeah, that's actually quite good. If I can actually get this back, there you go. And unlike many other Powershot cameras, there's actually a flash up here. What I meant by that is with all the other, well, not all, but many of the other Powershot cameras, The pop-up flash happens to be here, which actually helps with the red eye a little bit. Whereas with the cameras like the G10 here and many cameras before that, having a flash here is actually convenient, but in the same time, it's a little bit closer and kind of nearer to the lens itself, which means that if you're actually taking nighttime portraits with a flash, then there's a higher chance of getting that red eye versus having a flash that's a bit further and away from the lens itself. But then of course, if you're not really taking a lot of portraits with a flash, then it's also something that you don't really have to concern with. So yeah, moving on to the next point, which is the battery life. The battery life on this camera is actually quite nice. It shares the same battery with so many other Canon Powershot models, to be honest. This is the NB7L battery. The G11, G12 also uses it as well. Oh, by the way, it also shares the same compartment with the actual SD card, which can be kind of an inconvenience. Let's say if you're doing like a long exposure kind of shoot, or if you're actually shooting a video and having your camera onto the tripod the whole time and the battery runs out, for example, you have to kind of like unscrew the tripod, because the tripod mount is pretty much right next to the door, and obviously it will cover that. And if you have the plate, let's say there, even if you take it out, you might only be able to open up this much. So it is a little bit cumbersome, and I just wish that the tripod mount would be more of in the center where the sensor is rather than over here. And also I just wish that there would be a separate SD card door, but you know, that's what I wish for. And moving to the side here, you actually have all of your essential ports that if you still use them, like your remote port, you know, you actually can have a remote connecting to this camera and do your intervalometer if you want. And if you prefer not wanting to use a self timer, you can also just, you know, have a remote up here. Then you can actually just press on the remote and then just, you know, fire right away, just to avoid that vibration or shakiness to the actual image while doing something like a long exposure photography. And then moving into the next point, which is pretty much the button layout and everything. So the button layout on here is actually pretty nice and very tactile. I really love them because they do feel very responsive, and even the dials up here on top of the camera, they all feel like very nicely resistant, if that makes sense, because a lot of dials on many of other compact cameras, they can feel a little bit too loose or too stiff. With the Canon compact cameras in general, what I find, whether it's with this camera or with the G1X, G16, G9, G11, G12, what have you, it's all very nicely placed and everything just has very nice resistance to it. So you're not going to be really finding yourself switching through these dials by accidentally in most cases. But yeah, I just really love the design and also love the button placement and everything. What I love about the button placement back here as well, especially the wheel, is because it's really nice and big. It's also very firm in the same time, that you don't feel like you're gonna accidentally turn the wheel, whereas with the G16 it's so thin that you just sometimes feel like you're gonna be turning the wheel, and yeah, that's actually kind of a bad thing. And but otherwise it's a very nice button feeling, and you can actually feel the confirmation even if you're working in cold weather condition, and also if you have really thick gloves, you still can really operate them, which is good. And talking about cold condition, let me actually get back to the battery for a little bit. The battery, despite being a very common battery, and yes, you still can find them brand new, especially on the third-party market, because it's so popular among so many cameras from Canon lines. It is still available out there brand new. But actually, let me get back onto the battery regarding the battery life itself. So the battery life itself is actually quite nice. I find that it actually operates in cold weather condition also quite nicely and reliably as well. The only gripe I have about it is maybe it's more of either the battery or the camera thing, that after using it 75% of the battery, the last 25% drains down really quickly. So just keep an eye out if you're going to be using this camera. I recommend getting at least 2 or 3 other batteries if you just want to enjoy shooting with this camera outdoor. But yeah, that's just pretty much my opinion on that. And now let me actually go more into the technical side of this camera. So this camera has the 5x optical zoom, and it's actually a really newly designed zoom lens from Canon after the G9, because the G9 had the I believe it was the 35 to around 210 millimeter equivalent to full frame focal length, whereas with this camera it has a full frame equivalent length of 28 to 140 millimeter. And yeah, to me, if you watch the video about the 1DX, I said something like, I wish that the 1DX would maybe shortened the telephoto lens just to have enough room so that they could actually fit a wider angle lens in here, because that would actually be much more practical, at least for what I use it for. So having, let's say, a 24mm focal range starting would be much better than the 28, because it would actually be more versatile and also more practical, especially for such a nice and professional camera. And not realizing that the G9, the model before the G10, had a 35mm starting focal range, I think they kind of understood my complaint, even though I only really made it in the previous video. Yeah, I just wish that it would actually happen to the G1X. But anyway, I find that the focal range is actually quite nice and versatile. Again, I do wish it would actually be a bit wider, but in the same time, coming from 35mm to 28mm, it's already a huge jump at the time. And of course, many compact cameras at the time were still using 35mm or somewhat around 30mm focal range anyway, so having 28 was actually quite wide. So yeah, that's what I really love about this zoom range. The lens itself is actually quite nice and sharp. The contrast control is quite nice, although it's a little bit of chromatic aberrations creeping in a little bit, but nothing you cannot fix in post, especially when this camera actually shoots in RAW. That's actually good. Talking about RAW, going into the software side of things, this camera actually has a very nice user-friendly menu as usual, as many of all of the other cameras do from Canon. And of course, navigating through not only the main menu, but also the quick menu on the screen is actually quite nice and efficient. Everything is really efficiently designed, laid out, and organized, so you can actually access everything logically and efficiently as well. So if you just want to, focus on the shot, focus on the moment, you're not really going to be, going around into the menu, going to the settings here and there. It feels like it's part of you, and then you can actually just rely on it, and then you can actually just kind of, set everything logically without thinking or being aware of it, and then just kind of, use it as pretty much your extension and just capture the moment, if that makes sense. And but moving on to somewhat of a negative point on this particular camera is it only shoots at 0.7 frames per second. And to me it is, I guess I understand, but I just wish it would be able to shoot a little bit faster, just for my taste, because I like a little bit faster camera, especially if I'm shooting outdoors, regardless of whether it's landscape or street photography or portraits. Having a tiny bit faster frames per second will always help to capture that split second of a moment that could actually make a huge mood difference within the image itself. But considering I've been using this camera mainly for just traveling and just documenting here and there rather than like a serious camera, I personally am fine with it. Just wish it would be a little bit faster, of course. The ISO range on this camera ranges between 80 to 1600, which is not a lot, but I will go more into the detail about the ISO quality later on, the image quality. But of course, I cannot really talk about frames per second without touching on the actual autofocusing system, because even if you have really high frame rates, but if the autofocusing system doesn't keep up, then it's kind of useless. The autofocusing on this camera is actually not slow, but it's actually quite okay. It's not fast. I wouldn't call it fast at all. It's just you expect it to just focus, and then it gets into the point, and then you take a picture. I really like the calmness of it. It's not fast, but it's also not bad. So for a person coming from like a mirrorless camera like the A7 IV that's filming me right now, or the R5, R6, the R, things like that, coming onto this camera, it's actually kind of like freshening up the mind a little bit, having an okay or good enough autofocusing speed on this camera, not doing anything serious with it, and just coming on with a fresh mentality, fresh mindset, and just focus on the actual scene, focus on the actual moment. I am sounding slowly a bit like one of those Leica owners, but in the same time, just take your time and just focus, and it will just not really distract you, and it's not slow that you'll be like, why can't it focus faster? It just gets its job done. And in low light, it is going to take longer time, but it will get there eventually. I would say that don't try to focus, let's say, pitch dark or like on the street at night, because it will probably have really hard time focusing depending on which street you're actually focusing at night. But in most cases, in kind of like semi-dimly lit situation or semi-lit indoor situations, then this camera would be able to actually do it. So with the autofocusing system. So there is that. Of course, being a camera from the year 2008, it doesn't have Wi-Fi or an FC, but you can live without it sometimes. And if you just want to experiment with using such an old compact camera. This camera really gives you really good flavors. And to be honest with you guys, I've brought this camera through so many weather conditions, whether it's extremely cold conditions or really warm heat wave conditions, and I'm glad to tell you guys that this camera really survives. Yes, it's not weather sealed, but in the same time, it will actually be able to shoot in kind of like light rain, light drizzle, so that's also pretty good. And if you're working in super cold environment or super hot environment, it might affect the battery life, of course, but it doesn't really affect the internal that much because this camera is really built solidly. So yeah, that's what I really admire about this camera. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the ergonomics and the usability of this camera. Let me now actually dive into the image quality. And for the image quality, let me first start with the photography side of things. So for the photography side of things, this camera actually allows you to capture at 14.7 megapixels, which is much higher than the 10 megapixels that you'd find on the previous G9 camera. But you know, it's being the only camera that has 14 megapixel or 14.7 megapixels to be exact, because the G11 and the G12 that came after that only had I believe it was 10 megapixels. Yeah, 10 megapixels. And to be honest, I find that with the raw quality and also the resolution on this camera, you can really get a lot of things done. But of course, you're not really going to see a huge detail jump, just a tiny bit more detail compared to the G11 and the G12. That being said, it's always good to have extra details anyway, right, guys? But in the same time, this sensor is also an older sensor, which means yeah, the ISO performance isn't really as good as, let's say, the G12. It is on par with the G11 because it pretty much has the same processor. But where the negative points start coming in is, well, this camera, the sensor is not really that good in low light as to be expected, but it does allow the camera to actually shoot at ISO 80, which is pretty good, because with ISO 80, for example, you can actually get really clean results. And in terms of ISO, I would not go over ISO 400. Worst case scenario, I wouldn't go over ISO 800 simply because you will see a lot of noise into the image. Even if you shoot raw, you will still see noise at ISO 800, but of course with the camera having 14.7 megapixels, you can actually trade in some of the resolution for denoising later in post, and that's where this camera actually comes in handy and actually gives you a higher advantage over the G11 and the G12, because the G11 and the G12 already has 10 megapixel sensor. So if you trade in some of the resolution, which is still a lot, 10 megapixels, let's be fair, but you know, when you trade that resolution in for some of the denoising feature and just to make the image cleaner, you feel like the softness also creeps in a little bit more on those files compared to this file as well. So yeah, there's that. But otherwise, I think that the image quality on a normal light condition, it's really great. And also you can actually do really nice prints with it, whether up to A2 or even A1, if you actually know what you're doing with the camera, and if you can actually set the camera to really capture what you actually want, and if you're not going to be overly manipulating your images to the point where it actually starts breaking, yeah, then you can actually do some really fine prints with this camera sensor. So yeah, that's actually just my experience. But yeah, otherwise, another negative point is the moire and aliasing. This actually goes the same with the G11 and the G12, of course. The moire and aliasing on this camera is very noticeable in conditions where you're actually shooting a lot of fine details. So just watch out for that. But it actually manages to render a lot of fine details from bricks quite fine. So yeah, it's only when you're actually photographing fine details from fabrics, like super fine repetitive details and patterns. So yeah, that's when it actually will get a little bit of trouble. But otherwise, it's great. The color science out of this camera is good. The rendition between each different color tones is also quite nice. The color reproduction and the color depth is also quite nice out of this camera. Remembering that it is from 2008 and it is a compact camera though, yeah, it is actually quite nice. And the skin tones on this camera, well, coming out of the sensor is also quite good as well. I really like it a lot. And yes, you will still get that very nice old digital look kind of vibe out of this camera, so that's actually quite good as well. And now going on to the video side of things, this camera, despite coming out in 2008, the same year as the 5D Mark II, it doesn't do HD video recording, not full HD, not HD, it does it at 640p, which of course at the time was quite okay, just that maybe 720p would have been a lot nicer on this camera in my opinion, but of course it's a compact camera and you get what you get at the time, and 640 was kind of the standard on most of the other compact cameras anyway. at the time. And of course you will still get that very nice color science from Canon, but where you will start, you know, seeing a lot of flaws is within the details, because it actually is very soft, 640p, and also not to mention that the dynamic range is not as good as in the photography mode. The photography mode, the dynamic range isn't really great either, but it is still good enough, especially if you shoot in RAW and want to pull back some of the shadows and highlights as well. So yeah, but in video mode, it's something to be desired for when it comes to dynamic range. But you know, if you're looking for that vintage look, that lack of dynamic range on this camera can actually give you that very strong vintage digital look as well. So yeah, there is that. And the moire and aliasing on this camera is also very apparent. So even though you do still get them in photography mode, but it is still does a good job at eliminating a lot of moire and aliasing. But in photography mode, but in video mode, a lot of those flaws just get overly emphasized with the moire and aliasing, so please watch out for that. Don't shoot a lot of super fine repetitive pattern details stuff. Just normal things will just be okay. So yeah, not much right there. It is what it is. It's not a lot of exciting features. It does video, but yeah, you just have to watch out what you do with it. And yeah, not much left to talk about apart from just leading into the conclusion. Well, to conclude this video, this camera is an absolutely nice camera for me to experiment and also to recommend with, because it does everything quite nicely. It gives you a lot of the manual controls. Of course, I didn't touch upon a lot of the automatic features, like anything in the scene modes or anything automated with this camera, because I mainly just shoot this with manual mode or aperture priority mode, things like that, because I like to control, or at least have most of the control to myself when it comes to using the camera. And this camera, despite being a camera that has a lot of limitations when it comes to the image quality and, you know, the output of it, but in the same time I really enjoyed using it because it allowed me to still retain a lot of those controls, yet, you know, getting the old vintage digital vibe out of this camera. So that's actually quite nice. And because it is a small form factor, I am able to actually take it out to so many places, put it into my jeans pocket, my trouser pocket, things like that. And it's such a small camera for me personally to just, you know, take it out with me and also just have that kind of like refreshment to the mind if I'm just, you know, need a little bit of that refreshment, if I can say, just to freshen up the mind a little bit. So yeah, it's a very nice and fun camera to use. So yeah, at the end of the day, I would still highly recommend this camera. And of course, this camera being a digital compact camera from that time, I'm also glad that it actually shoots up to 4,000th of a second shutter speed. I wish it would do 8,000th of a second, but 4,000th of a second is also pretty much good enough, especially considering the time when this camera was released for a compact camera. So yeah, that's actually quite good. I really like how solidly the build quality is. I really like how the design is, like, it's very tactile, it's very responsive, it's really reliable. The only time I wish that it would be more reliable is after focusing and then taking that shot, because just like most of the other compact cameras at the time, after the confirmation of the autofocusing system has been confirmed, there's that like half a second that you have to wait before the picture is actually taken. Actually, not even half a second, but there's that ever so slightly delay, so that's something I really don't like. But in the same time, it does slow things down, and it also helps to freshen up your mind a little bit. And with the limitations, it actually allows you to actually think outside the box a little bit as well. So yeah, overall, it's a very nice experimental camera that I would personally recommend. And of course, 14 megapixel is still good enough, you know, if you still want to do your fine prints, things like that, still being able to get into the vintage digital look. Because for example, if you're going to be experimenting with something like the G1 right here, for example, it's going to give you a completely different feel of vibe or vintage feel that you'll get with this camera. But because it's only 3.3 megapixels, and of course having like a 4K monitor behind me right now, it does look very pixelated and soft, but you still get that feel. It's just extra pixelated and soft. Whereas this resolution, you still can get that kind of like the old digital vintage vibe, but the resolution would still be good enough for you to do some really fine prints and also, you know, put them on bigger screens if you want to, things like that. So yeah, it's something that I would really recommend. But of course, if you're looking for a camera that would have more dynamic range, would be more responsive after taking pictures, would actually have a much more sensitive autofocusing system, then this camera is not really a camera for you, I'm afraid. But in the same time, if you're willing to give this camera a try, and if you just want to slow down a little bit of your workflow and just have a nice manual camera, well, if you want to go manual, then you can really go manual camera to really try out on a compact level and also under 100 euros, then yeah, this camera is another nice camera to really consider. Whew. And yeah, that's it for this video. Before it gets any longer, I think all of my points, well, all of my main points have been said enough. Of course, there's so many other features in this camera that Canon added in, but personally I didn't use, that's why I didn't really mention it in this video. But I hope you can actually learn something from this video as well. And if you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free on my website. It's mine, and you can just click the link down in the description section below. Just click and download. I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. You don't need to submit your email address, nothing, just click and download. If you have any stories to share, any recommendations, any questions, or just want to share something about this camera or your photography journey or what have you, feel free to actually comment down in the comment section down below as well. I'll do my best to read every one of them and also do my best to reply to them as soon as I can. Whew. Otherwise, I thank you very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.